The cat's posture was tense, as if something invisible was holding it in place. Maya frowned, a shiver running down her spine. "What are you seeing?" she murmured, leaning in a bit closer to observe. What seemed like a common scene quickly turned into something she couldn't quite comprehend. It wasn't just the strange behavior of a cat, there was something trapped there, something that needed to be discovered. Maya felt her heart quicken, doubt turning into an impulse. Was it a trap, an injured animal, or something else? This story begins with the golden hues of the evening sun bathed the Seine in a soft, ethereal glow as Maya walked along the cobblestone streets of Paris. The city, alive with its familiar rhythm, unfolded around her, the distant murmur of tourists admiring the Eiffel Tower, the smell of freshly baked bread wafting from nearby cafés, and the occasional clang of a bicycle bell as commuters navigated the narrow lanes. Maya, a graphic designer in her late 20s, found herself lost in this comforting chaos after another long day at work. She moved with the crowd, her steps steady but her eyes distant, her mind tethered to the monotony of her daily routine. Despite the vibrancy of the city, Maya felt a sense of detachment, as if she were only an observer in her own life. Her job, once a passion, had become a source of exhaustion, draining her of creativity and leaving her yearning for something more. But there was one thing that broke the cycle of her day, an alleyway she visited every evening, just a few blocks from her apartment. It was a narrow, unassuming passage, easily overlooked by those unfamiliar with its secrets. But Maya knew it well, for it was where she tended to a small group of stray cats. As she neared the alley, she instinctively reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the familiar crinkle of cat food packets. It was her quiet ritual, a small act of kindness she clung to, a moment where she could feel a sense of purpose. The cats were already gathering, their sleek bodies darting in and out of shadows, eager for their nightly meal. Maya crouched down, whispering softly to them as she placed the food on the ground. They surrounded her, purring and meowing in anticipation. Among them was one cat she had named Midnight due to his dark, glossy fur that seemed to absorb the fading light of the evening. Midnight had always been her favorite. He was cautious but curious, watching her with an intensity that suggested he knew more than the other cats. Tonight, however, something was different. Instead of approaching the food, Midnight lingered near the storm drain at the edge of the alley, his eyes fixated on something below. Maya's brows furrowed as she watched him, her curiosity piqued. Midnight's body was tense, his tail flicking as if he sensed something she couldn't see. The other cats seemed oblivious, content with their meal, but Midnight remained still, his gaze unbroken. Maya felt a shiver run down her spine, a fleeting sensation of unease mixed with intrigue. She shook it off, assuming it was nothing, just Midnight's peculiar behavior. Still, as she continued feeding the others, she found herself glancing back at the storm drain. Midnight's eyes caught hers, and for a moment it felt like he was trying to tell her something, his meow low and insistent. She almost approached him, her fingers itching to lift the grate and peer inside, but she hesitated. It was late, and she was tired. The thought of investigating felt like a burden after such a long day. With a sigh, she turned away, promising herself it was nothing more than a stray cat's whim. As she walked home, the image of Midnight, with his unblinking stare and tense posture, lingered in her mind. The streets of Paris, now illuminated by streetlights, blurred into the background as she tried to shake off the feeling. But it was no use. The alley, the storm drain, and the cat's fixed gaze stayed with her, a puzzle waiting to be solved. The next evening, Maya found herself walking the same route, the rhythm of her day playing out like clockwork. The city buzzed with its usual energy. Street performers entertained crowds, cafe tables were filled with lively chatter, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the crisp autumn air. But tonight, her mind wasn't on the scenery or the routine of her walk. It was on Midnight and his strange behavior from the previous evening. As she turned the corner into the alley, she spotted the familiar silhouettes of the cats waiting for her, their eyes reflecting the streetlights. But it was Midnight who caught her attention once again. He was in the exact same spot, hovering near the storm drain, his posture tense and alert. This time, he seemed more agitated, his tail twitching with urgency as he meowed persistently. his eyes never leaving the darkness below. Maya's curiosity sharpened, the unease from yesterday returning as a knot in her stomach. She called out to Midnight softly, hoping to coax him away, but the cat's cries grew louder, almost as if he were pleading for her to understand. The other cats, sensing his agitation, kept their distance, their attention fixed on Maya, as if waiting for her to do something. Kneeling down, she set her bag aside and crawled closer to the storm drain, her fingers grazing the cold metal grate. Midnight continued to meow, his voice echoing against the walls of the alley. The sense of urgency in his cries was unmistakable, and Maya couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was indeed wrong. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled out her phone, turning on the flashlight feature as she peered into the storm drain. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the damp, concrete walls below. For a moment, there was nothing, just shadows and debris. But then, a flash of movement caught her eye. She held her breath, leaning closer as her heart quickened. A pair of tiny eyes reflected back at her from the depths, blinking in the harsh light. She thought she saw the flicker of small paws before the creature scurried further into the shadows. A chill ran down her spine. She blinked, unsure if she had imagined it. Midnight's persistent cries, however, told her otherwise. She angled the light again, trying to get a better view, but the creature had vanished, leaving only the darkness behind. Maya felt a conflict rising within her. Part of her wanted to dismiss it, to return to the comfort of her apartment and forget about the alley, but another part of her, a deeper instinct, whispered that this was important. The cat's behavior, the flash of tiny eyes, something was in that drain. Maya bit her lip, torn between her desire for the familiarity of her evening routine and the gnawing sense of curiosity and concern Midnight had sparked in her. She finally decided to brush it off, convincing herself that it was likely a rat or some other harmless animal. Rising to her feet, she shook her head at the cat, who continued to stare at her, unblinking. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself, as if making a promise she wasn't sure she intended to keep. As she walked away, the sounds of Midnight's meows echoed behind her, following her home like a lingering echo, refusing to be forgotten. The next day, Maya couldn't shake the thought of Midnight and the storm drain. Throughout her work hours, her mind drifted back to the alley, the flash of tiny eyes, and the insistent cries of the cat. She tried to concentrate on her projects, staring at her computer screen filled with design drafts and deadlines, but everything seemed to blur into the background. It felt as though the events of the previous night were a riddle that demanded an answer. By the time the workday ended, Maya was resolved. She left her office with a determined stride, her bag heavier than usual. Earlier that afternoon, she had made a quick stop at a hardware store, picking up a small flashlight and gloves. If there was something trapped down there, she wanted to be prepared. Her thoughts raced as she hurried down the bustling streets, the familiar sounds and sights of Paris fading into the periphery. When she finally reached the alley, she was greeted by the usual group of cats. They approached her with their usual anticipation, but Maya's focus was singular: Midnight. He was in his usual spot, his eyes locked onto the storm drain as if he had never left. Tonight, his agitation was palpable. His fur stood on end, and his cries grew louder when he saw her approach. Maya knelt down, setting aside her bag as she slipped on the gloves. She reached out to Midnight, gently stroking his back in an attempt to soothe him. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. The cat, unrelenting, meowed insistently before taking a few steps back, giving her room to investigate. This time, Maya wasn't content to simply glance inside. She pulled out the flashlight, her hands steady as she illuminated the interior of the drain. The beam was much stronger than the light from her phone, piercing the shadows more effectively. As she scanned the damp, narrow tunnel, her heart quickened. There it was again, a flicker of movement. Maya leaned in, her face close to the cold metal grate. She spotted them, small, furry bodies huddled together, their tiny eyes wide and fearful as they caught the light. It wasn't just one or two, it was a whole litter of kittens. Their fur, matted and dirty, clung to their fragile bodies, and they looked weak and malnourished. For a moment, she was stunned, her breath catching in her throat. Midnight had been trying to show her this all along. She pulled back, feeling a rush of emotion. It all made sense now. Midnight's agitation, his persistence in returning to the same spot every night. He had been watching over these kittens, trying desperately to get her attention. Maya felt a swell of responsibility and compassion, her heart aching for the tiny creatures shivering in the cold depths of the drain. She reached out, her fingers gripping the edges of the grate as she tried to peer further inside, hoping she could somehow reach them. But the kittens were too deep, beyond her immediate reach. Frustration clawed at her as she tried to think of a solution. She called out softly, "It's okay, little ones. I'm here to help." But the kittens only huddled closer together, their small bodies shivering as they pressed against the concrete walls. Maya pulled back and glanced at Midnight, who had been watching her every move. "I can't get to them," she said, her voice tinged with worry. Midnight meowed again, pacing restlessly as if urging her to find a way. She knew she couldn't leave them there, but the question was how to get them out safely. The drain was too narrow for her to climb into, and the kittens were too far to reach from her position. Her mind raced with possibilities. She could call someone, maybe an animal rescue service, or try to find some equipment that might help her retrieve them. But as she stood there, with Midnight still meowing urgently beside her, Maya realized that time was slipping away. The kittens needed her, and she had to figure out a plan, fast. With a sigh, she picked up her bag and reached for her phone, already searching for the number of a local animal rescue. "I'll be back," she promised, glancing down at Midnight, who watched her with eyes full of trust and expectation. She could only hope she wouldn't be too late. Maya's fingers flew over her phone screen as she dialed the number for a local animal rescue service. She explained the situation, her voice urgent and filled with concern. The operator on the other end listened attentively, but when they spoke, their tone was apologetic. They were dealing with multiple emergencies and only had limited staff available. The soonest they could send someone would be a few hours. Maya's heart sank. She glanced up at the sky, where dark clouds were gathering, heavy and ominous. The smell of rain hung in the air, mingling with the city's scents. She looked down at the storm drain, the tiny eyes of the kittens still in her mind. The thought of leaving them there, vulnerable and frightened, gnawed at her. But with the storm coming, their situation was becoming even more urgent. If rain filled the drain, the kittens could be trapped or worse. As the first drops began to fall, she knew she couldn't wait. The sense of responsibility she felt was too strong. "I'm not leaving them," she whispered to herself, determination settling in. She scanned her surroundings, her eyes landing on her bag. Rummaging through it, she found a small length of rope she had picked up earlier, intending to use it if necessary. She tied a piece of cat food to one end, hoping to lure the kittens closer. Kneeling down, she lowered the makeshift harness into the drain, her eyes fixed on the tiny, shivering forms below. She spoke softly, coaxing them. "It's okay, little ones. Come on, you can do it." But the kittens, overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty, stayed huddled together, their eyes reflecting the light with a glint of hesitation. Just as Maya was about to reposition the rope, something unexpected happened. Midnight, who had been pacing beside her, suddenly jumped down into the drain. Maya gasped, her heart leaping in her chest as she watched the cat maneuver into the narrow space. He moved with an agility that surprised her, navigating the tight confines as if it were a natural path. The kittens seemed to respond to his presence, their small heads lifting as he approached them. She watched in awe as Midnight nudged the kittens gently, his body language protective and purposeful. He meowed softly, urging them to follow. Slowly, one by one, the kittens began to respond, inching closer to the opening. Maya felt a surge of hope as she saw the first kitten move toward her rope. She guided it, carefully lifting the food closer, and soon enough, the kitten grabbed onto it, its tiny paws reaching for the rope. Maya's hands worked steadily, her pulse quickening as she pulled the first kitten out of the drain and into her arms. She felt a rush of relief as she cradled the small, trembling body, placing it safely in her bag to keep it warm. Midnight continued his efforts below, guiding the next kitten toward her. But just as she was about to reach for the second one, the rain intensified. Heavy drops began to pelt the ground, turning the alley slick and wet. Water started trickling into the drain, gathering momentum as it surged toward the opening. Maya's urgency spiked. The kittens were still in danger, and the situation was becoming dire. She pulled the second kitten out, but as she reached for the third, the water levels began to rise faster than she anticipated. "Come on, Midnight," she called, her voice tense with fear. The cat, however, remained focused on the kittens, his instincts driving him to protect them. Maya's hands were now slick with rain, and she struggled to maintain her grip as the water surged. Midnight meowed frantically, and Maya realized she needed to act quickly before it was too late. She repositioned herself, leaning into the drain as far as she could, straining against the cold metal edges. She managed to grasp the third kitten, pulling it out just as a gush of water rushed in. Midnight was now the only one left with the remaining two kittens, his body partially submerged as he tried to push them toward Maya's outstretched hands. The rain turned into a downpour, and Maya's vision blurred as the water streamed down her face. She fought to stay steady, her heart pounding in her chest. "You can do this," she urged, her voice cracking as she watched Midnight's struggle. The cat meowed again, his eyes locking with hers for a brief moment before he pushed the fourth kitten closer. With a final effort, Maya grabbed the fourth kitten, lifting it out and placing it safely beside the others. Midnight, drenched and shivering, remained behind with the last kitten. The water level was now dangerously high, and Maya's panic surged. She extended her hand further, calling Midnight with a desperate plea. "Come on, boy. It's not safe." Just as Midnight began to climb out, carrying the final kitten in his mouth, a surge of water rushed in, knocking him off balance. Maya's heart clenched as she watched him struggle against the current. Without hesitation, she reached deeper into the drain, her arm stretching as far as it could go. Her fingers brushed against Midnight's fur, and she tightened her grip, pulling with all her strength. The cat, clinging tightly to the kitten, scrambled up, and with Maya's help, they both made it to safety. She collapsed back onto the wet ground, the kitten and Midnight in her arms. For a moment, the relief was overwhelming, and she held them close, feeling the rain pour over her as the kittens huddled for warmth. The rescue team arrived, just as the water filled the drain completely. They rushed over, their equipment in hand, but paused as they saw Maya, drenched and cradling the kittens, with Midnight sitting protectively beside her. The relief on her face was matched by their admiration. The rescue team arrived just as the water filled the drain completely. They rushed over, their equipment in hand, but paused as they saw Maya, drenched and cradling the kittens, with Midnight sitting protectively beside her. The relief on her face was matched by their admiration. Though the ordeal was over, Maya knew that this was only the beginning. Midnight and the kittens were safe for now, but there were still questions that needed answers. The storm had passed, leaving the air cold and heavy with the scent of rain-soaked concrete. Maya sat on the sidewalk, shivering, her clothes drenched through. The rescue team, a small group with grim faces and professional efficiency, worked quickly to assess the situation. They brought out blankets and cages, their hands moving deftly as they prepared to transport the kittens and Midnight to safety. Maya, though exhausted, insisted on staying close. She watched as they gently placed each kitten in a carrier, their tiny bodies still shivering but alive. Midnight, now calmer, sat beside Maya, his eyes darting between the rescuers and the kittens. When they tried to pick him up, he hissed, stepping protectively in front of the carrier. Maya could see the fear and confusion in his eyes, and she knew he wasn't just being defensive. He was scared for the kittens he had fought so hard to protect. One of the rescuers, a woman with kind eyes, approached Maya and gestured toward Midnight. "We need to get him in, but he seems a bit agitated. Could you help calm him down?" she asked. Maya nodded, understanding the situation immediately. She crouched beside Midnight, her voice soft and soothing. "Hey, it's okay, Midnight. They're here to help." She reached out her hand, moving slowly until her fingers brushed his wet fur. Midnight flinched at first, but as Maya continued to whisper reassurances, he relaxed slightly, allowing her to stroke him. The rescuers paused, watching as Maya gently coaxed Midnight closer to the carrier. She could see his hesitation, the way he glanced back at the kittens as if to make sure they were truly safe. Maya's heart ached for him. He had taken on the role of a guardian, risking his own safety to protect the little ones. "You've done your job," she whispered. "Let them take care of you now." Slowly, Midnight stepped back, allowing the rescuers to carefully lift him into a carrier beside the kittens. Maya breathed a sigh of relief, her shoulders relaxing as she watched them close the door. The hardest part was over, or so she thought. As they packed up, the woman from the rescue team approached her again. "You did a great job back there. Without you, they might not have made it." She gave Maya a warm smile. "We're going to take them to the shelter, give them the medical attention they need." Maya felt a wave of relief, but also a lingering sense of responsibility. "I'd like to come with you," she said. "I want to make sure they're okay." The woman hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Of course. Follow us." At the Animal Rescue Center, the fluorescent lights and sterile smells were a stark contrast to the cold, wet alley they had just left behind. Maya watched anxiously as the kittens were examined one by one. Midnight, who had finally relaxed, allowed the staff to check him over, though he kept his eyes on Maya the entire time. The veterinarian approached her, clipboard in hand. "The kittens are malnourished and dehydrated, but they should recover with proper care," she explained. "Midnight seems healthy overall, though a bit underweight." She paused, studying Maya's face. "It's not uncommon for a stray cat to adopt a litter of kittens like this, especially if they're orphaned." Maya felt a knot in her chest. "So you think Midnight has been caring for them this whole time?" The vet nodded. "Most likely. He was probably drawn to them after they were abandoned. Cats like Midnight, stray but resourceful, they often become protectors for vulnerable animals. He's done more for those kittens than most would." Maya's eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Midnight, with so little of his own, had given everything to protect those kittens. It was both heartwarming and heartbreaking, knowing he had been their sole guardian. She felt a sense of connection with him, a bond formed through the shared experience of rescuing those fragile lives. But her thoughts were interrupted when the vet added, "There's one complication, though." Maya's stomach tightened. Midnight is very attached to the kittens, and if they're separated too soon, it could cause him distress. "We'd normally keep them together for a while, but the kittens will eventually need new homes. Midnight, too." The implication hung in the air, and Maya's mind raced. She knew what the vet was hinting at, that these animals, so connected and reliant on one another, would soon face separation unless someone intervened. Maya's heart ached at the thought of them being torn apart after everything they had been through. She glanced at Midnight, who was sitting quietly in his carrier, watching the kittens with a focused gaze. His loyalty, his protective nature, everything about him had touched her deeply. She couldn't imagine allowing him to face yet another loss. "Is there any way I could help?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop herself. "I mean, could I foster them, at least for a while?" The vet's eyes brightened. "That would be wonderful if you're able. It would give Midnight the chance to stay with the kittens a bit longer and make the transition easier when the time comes." Maya felt a rush of resolve. Her life had been so ordinary, so routine, but this felt different. It felt right. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady with conviction. "I'll foster them." As the arrangements were made, Maya realized that her solitary life was about to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had made a decision that would bring new responsibilities and challenges, but she welcomed them. Midnight and the kittens had entered her life unexpectedly, but they had filled a space she hadn't known was empty. In the following days, Maya's life transformed in ways she hadn't expected. Her once quiet apartment, with its neatly arranged furniture and muted tones, now buzzed with life. The kittens, now gaining strength, explored their new surroundings with boundless energy, their tiny paws skittering across the wooden floor. Midnight, ever watchful, followed them closely, guiding them away from trouble and occasionally pausing to rest beside Maya, as if to express his gratitude. Each day, Maya grew more attached to the little family. The kittens, with their playful antics and soft purrs, brought joy she hadn't felt in a long time. Midnight, though still cautious, had warmed up to her presence, curling up beside her on the couch during quiet moments. His protective instincts remained strong, but he allowed himself brief moments of relaxation. his eyes closing as he nestled against her side. A few days later, Maya found herself back at the Animal Rescue Center for a checkup. The kittens had grown visibly stronger, and Midnight seemed healthier, with his coat shining under the fluorescent lights. The veterinarian smiled as she looked over the group, her expression approving. "They're doing wonderfully," she said, scribbling notes on her clipboard. "The kittens are ready for adoption soon, and Midnight, well, he's thrived thanks to your care." Maya felt a swell of pride. It was a relief to know that all her efforts, the sleepless nights and the worry, had paid off. But as she watched the kittens play on the examination table, a sense of sadness crept in. The thought of them leaving, of Midnight being separated from the little ones he had risked everything to save, weighed heavily on her. The vet, noticing the shift in Maya's expression, offered her a sympathetic smile. "You've done an amazing job with them, Maya, but I know it's not easy to let go, especially after all you've been through together." Maya nodded, her throat tightening. She had prepared herself for this moment, knowing that fostering the kittens meant eventually saying goodbye. But seeing Midnight's devotion, the way he hovered over the kittens even now, made it clear that separating them would be more than just hard. It would be heartbreaking. Later that evening, as Maya sat in her apartment with Midnight curled in her lap and the kittens playing at her feet, she felt the weight of a decision pressing down on her. She knew she could let the kittens go, find them homes, and keep her life as simple as it had been before. But every time she thought of Midnight being left alone, she felt a deep pang in her chest. He had given so much, protected those tiny lives with everything he had, and she couldn't imagine taking that from him. The next day, she returned to the rescue center, her resolve firm. The same vet who had initially helped her met her with a curious look. "Maya, is everything all right?" Maya took a deep breath. "I've been thinking, I don't want to separate Midnight from the kittens. He's taken care of them for so long. And well, I want to adopt them all." The vet's eyes widened, but then her expression softened into a warm smile. "Are you sure? It's a big commitment." Maya nodded, feeling a certainty she hadn't felt in a long time. "I'm sure. They belong together, and they belong with me." That evening, as Maya finalized the paperwork, she felt a profound sense of purpose. Her life, once quiet and predictable, had shifted into something fuller, something more meaningful. She had found a new beginning in the unlikeliest of places, a storm drain on a rainy night. When they finally returned home, the kittens ran through the apartment, their tiny mews filling the space with a joyful noise. Midnight followed close behind, his eyes no longer filled with the cautious wariness she had first seen, but with trust and contentment. Maya watched them, her heart full. She had taken a chance on a stray cat's cry for help, and it had led her to a new chapter, one filled with life, companionship, and a bond that could never be broken. In the months that followed, Maya's life transformed completely. Her once quiet apartment was now filled with life as the kittens explored and played. Midnight, always vigilant, continued to protect them and became a constant, loving presence by Maya's side. Inspired by her new companions, she started creating art based on them, reigniting her passion for her work. Maya decided to adopt the entire family, understanding that they belonged together and with her. She became involved with the rescue center, sharing her story and encouraging others to adopt animals. Midnight, once a stray, had not only found a home, but also helped Maya find new purpose. Sitting on her balcony with Midnight and the kittens, Maya reflected on how a simple decision had changed her life. The unexpected bond she formed with them filled her days with love and purpose. Midnight, who had once arrived with nothing, had ended up giving her everything, a life full of meaning and companionship. She knew that, with them by her side, she would never feel alone again.